Hello, hello. Of course, we are talking about Section 8 and other affordable housing programs today, all of which are funded by the government. So we are focusing on government-funded public housing, and we will go through various programs throughout this chat. Now, I know that Section 8 is a topic with a lot of stigma around it. When we held this presentation on Tuesday, we had a very lively chat. While we love to have lively chats, I think it's really important to highlight that we are talking about an affordable housing program. We will not be tolerating any kind of unkind language about the people receiving Section 8 housing choice vouchers or any other participants in affordable housing programs. There is a way to express your thoughts and sentiments about these different programs without getting unkind in the chat. And if we do see that kind of behavior, we will stop talking. We'll address it live as much as we can without derailing the entire presentation. But please keep it civil, keep it polite. Don't say anything in the chat you wouldn't say to your grandma, or better yet, my grandma, because you don't know her and you should be polite to old ladies that you don't know. So again, share your experiences, share your questions, but keep it polite, keep it kind, because at the end of the day, we're all here to learn about something and to communicate about this program. And the best way to do that is to make sure that we can all share our thoughts and opinions. Anything you want to add, Samantha?
Yeah, just one final note is that TurboTenant is not actually affiliated with these government programs. TurboTenant is software for landlords to manage their rentals. So we are providing a bridge or a bridge of the gap of information for landlords that use TurboTenant who are interested perhaps in Section 8 and landlords who don't use TurboTenant who are interested in Section 8. So we are not directly affiliated with the public housing authorities, these government assistance programs. We are just putting the information out there so that you can make informed decisions on if this is the right program for you.
Exactly. So to that end, we have some key areas of focus today. If you'd love to share those, Samantha, I would love to hear it.
I really would love to share these. So the key area of focus, the first one, we're going to touch on the need for affordable housing. We're also going to take a look at the different types of housing programs. There are different ones in there. It's not all Section 8. We'll also take a peek into the eligibility and demographics of these programs, as well as the benefits and drawbacks. And at the end, we will have a FAQ or Q&A or FAQs and a Q&A. And if you have additional questions, we also have a Facebook group called Better Landlords, where you can join and keep the conversation going. We have, I think, 3 or 4 different threads right now about Section 8, hearing from our over 1,000 landlords in our group and their experiences. So it's pretty exciting to see. You can head on over there to chat some more.
Beautiful. Cannot wait to hop into this. So first and foremost, why are we talking about Section 8 and assisted housing programs? This specific question, why we talk about it, came up during this month's Turbo Talk at the very beginning of the month, because somebody was curious if TurboTenant had some kind of connection to Section 8. They saw that we talked about it and they wanted to know more. As Samantha said, we are not connected to Section 8 housing in any way, other than being a premier provider of landlord property management software, which anybody can use, right? So you can use that if you're in the program, if you're not in the program, if you're curious, etc. The real reason that we talk about it, though, is because there is an affordable housing crisis in the United States. Specifically, there is not a state amongst our 50 that has affordable rental housing for the lowest income renters to the degree that they need it. In fact, we are short by over 7 million units nationally, which is quite a bit. And unfortunately, according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, renters with incomes that are at or below the federal poverty line, or about 30% of their area median income, are the ones who are really suffering the most. So between 2019 and 2021, the shortage in the number of affordable units actually increased by more than 500,000 homes. So if we put that another way, in the height of COVID, there were even fewer options available for people who have really low income, which, as you can imagine, what just made that hard situation even harder. But let's take a look at it through a couple of charts. So here, this is a chart from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and it shows you where this issue is the most pressing. So the darker the color, the fewer affordable units available per 100 extremely low income renter households. You can see we definitely have issues on the West Coast and Colorado, along with Texas and Florida. We've got a couple issues here on the East Coast, but by and large, it's concentrated really over on this area. And if we were to pull out a map of property values, I think you'd be unsurprised to learn that a lot of these places are also really expensive to live in general. They have very high property values. I mean, California comes to mind. So this is a big issue, and unfortunately, it's just going to continue getting worse. So if we take a look at the burden of housing costs on renters based on their income, you can see that over time, being severely burdened has increased for folks, especially if they are on the lower end of the income spectrum. So when they have under $15,000 as their income, over 20 years, 75% of them became severely burdened by their housing costs. This is why we talk about Section 8 housing. It's one way that if landlords feel like it's the right fit for their business, they can get involved. Again, there are other ways to get involved. Joining a public housing assistance program is not for everybody. And we're going to go through some things you should keep in mind to figure out if it's right for you. But here's why we talk about it. Before we move on, I am curious. Tell us in the chat, which state you think has the highest number of extremely low income renter households. If you need to remind yourself which states are which, here we go. Which of these states has the highest number of extremely low income renter households?
California, Ohio, Florida, Georgia, California, Florida, California, Washington, Florida, Cali, Mississippi, Texas, California, Maryland, Colorado, Florida, Washington, California, Texas. My gosh, they're so fast. Kansas, California, Mississippi, Kentucky, Texas, Washington, Florida, Maryland, Washington.
Loving the participation. It's going to run fast, but a lot of you got it right. It is actually California. So California has 1,308,328 extremely low income renter households. Then, perhaps unsurprisingly, New York is the second most, and then we have Texas with the third most number of extremely low income households. So again, these are huge hubs for all sorts of things, including, unfortunately, a need for affordable housing. Something else that I think is interesting before we move on is that when we look at the overall median monthly rent, that increased 3% from 2019 to 2021. So COVID times, but the median renter income fell by 2% during that same period. However, if we get even deeper in the data, that difference is exaggerated even farther for those earning less than $30,000 because their rents rose by 5% and incomes fell by 6% during that same period. So again, it's a problem that keeps getting worse, so it's worth talking about in this kind of scope. Okay. And when we talk about Section 8 housing, a very common thing that comes up are source of income discrimination laws. So if you're unfamiliar, a source of income discrimination law basically says that landlords cannot discriminate against potential tenants or tenants that they already have signed to a lease based on how they pay their rent. So specifically here, that means if somebody comes in with a housing choice voucher, in these states where you have state or city protections, you can't reject them simply on the basis of them having that voucher, okay? We'll go through what you do instead and how you move along that process, but it's just a good spot to take a look at the map. This is very recent. It's as of May 1st, 2023. But I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you to do your due diligence, make sure you're looking up your individual state laws, and especially your city and county protections, because again, that is going to be different than the state level in some spots. So make sure that you know your rules and that you are following them to the T. All right. So as I mentioned, I do not believe, and I know Samantha doesn't believe, that every landlord should participate in assisted housing programs because there are a lot of situations in which that wouldn't be the right fit for you. For example, and we'll touch on this later too, but there is a bureaucratic delay in getting your first subsidy check from the government for your rent. So if you're uncomfortable or you wouldn't be able to float your business for a month to 3 months while you wait for that check to come through, this probably is not for you. If you are hesitant to charge market rent or you are worried about the caps and not being able to raise rent when you want to raise it, it is still possible, which we'll talk about too. But if you want that level of control, okay, this is probably not the right solution for you. Or if you typically vote against government subsidy programs, it probably isn't going to be a good fit to become a Section 8 landlord. And here I'm using Section 8 interchangeably with the Housing Choice Voucher Program because the latter is a mouthful, but just know I am referring to that interchangeably. And if you have questions, let us know in the Q&A. All right, So we know that not every landlord should participate in Section 8 housing. But there are states where, as you saw in the last slide, there are laws protecting against source of income discrimination. So what do you do? Well, if you are in such a state, you need to evaluate each potential applicant as you would anyone else. So you would not be able to advertise like no Section 8 accepted in your listing or anything like that. However, that doesn't mean that you have to accept every applicant with a Section 8 voucher. Instead, continue with your screening process, make sure that you are holding everyone to the same standards. And if they don't meet those standards, then you can reject them as you would any other tenant. If you've used their screening report to make your decision, ensure that you're sending them an adverse notice letter so that they can take action on their own and review their screening report, reach out to their credit bureaus, etc. But otherwise, nothing to worry about. Follow your typical process. Just be sure that you're not making screening harder or costlier for Section 8 applicants, or else you will risk fair housing violations. So for example, if you are typically accepting 3 times the amount of rent for everybody, but then you see someone with a Section 8 voucher coming in to apply and you say, well, for you it'd be 5 times the monthly rent, that would be a fair housing violation. Okay. Excuse me. Also, when you have that kind of specific criteria, especially if you can back it up with the amenities in your property or what have you, you're going to get far fewer of the Section 8 applicants because they're less likely to be able to cover your rent costs with their voucher. Something to keep in mind. If you live in a state that does not have that does not have source of income discrimination laws, again, this makes it even easier. Just avoid participating. So do not submit your property for approval for the program. And then you're just wanting to maintain all of the specific tenant criteria that you usually use and apply that to all applicants, including those with Section 8 vouchers. So it can be very simple. It tends to get overcomplicated, but really it's just about evaluating the applicant based on your criteria and knowing the laws in your land, whether that's your state or your county. Okay. So this is a good spot to just pause before we jump into the different types of public housing. Samantha, what do we have going on in the Q&A?
Yes. So we have a landlord asking, can you decline an application for insufficient income?
Yes, you absolutely can. So if they have the housing choice voucher, but their yearly income does not match what you would typically have, then you are absolutely well within your rights to reject them and move on. Just as you would reject any other tenant, I would recommend having just a vague but polite message that affirms their right to contact the credit bureau, review their documentation, all of that. You don't have to get super specific and say, hey, your income was the reason why. Something to keep in mind.
We also have a question from William. I find Section 8 case workers are insufficient and unresponsive. How would you recommend to best get them to return calls or get paperwork done in a timely manner?
Ooh, yeah, that's the frustrating part of the government, right? Like the bureaucracy and things just taking a long time. It's going to vary based on your PHA, which is your public housing agency, the people who are in charge of your local program. But if you're struggling to get a hold of one caseworker, I would try and couple things. One, either CC their boss if you have their information, if you have their email address. I would do that, have them on the message, let them know that you've been trying to reach out. If you're still not getting anywhere and there's a physical office where you can show up, I would try and make an appointment and show up there. It's very hard to ignore you if you have an appointment and you're sitting across from the person asking them the questions that you need answers to. So that would be the route that I would take, but that's super frustrating. I'm sorry that's happening.
Okay, if a state requires that you accept Section 8 applicants, then should we also consider added move-in delays due to property approval in the Section 8 program, even if we didn't want to pursue Section 8 to begin with?
Ooh, definitely a tricky situation. So what I'm understanding the question to be is that should they account for extra time for the process if they get a Section 8 applicant who meets their criteria? Yes, you will need, and we'll go through the qualifications for the program toward the end of the presentation, but you will have to have that inspection done. And hopefully that can be done in a timely manner. I would reach out. So if I'm in your shoes, I've gotten my applicant, they meet all my criteria, they have this voucher. At that point, I would start working with them to try and get these kinds of things scheduled. Even if the lease isn't signed yet, I would start talking to them about how soon can we get the inspector out here, what are the next steps, etc., so you can keep it moving along.
One more, then I'm going to let you scooch.
Sure.
If you're not approved for the program, can you decline the applicant based on that?
Yeah. Well, so yeah, if you're not approved for the program, you can absolutely decline the applicant. It kind of sounds like maybe you wanted to be in the program and you applied. If that's not the case, then that's okay. But if it's a situation where you didn't want to be in the program and you didn't get approved, yes, if your property does not work for the program based on some of the qualifications we'll go over here later, then you do not have to move forward. You should take that into consideration when considering like what maintenance projects to do next and what tasks to get done, because they're going to be pointing out things that make the property livable and safe for folks. So even if you don't want to fulfill that in conjunction with the program, consider fulfilling that for your future tenants.
Nice.
All right. Good crop of questions. Keep them coming in that Q&A, but we're going to go ahead and scoot into the different types of public housing programs. So there are quite a few. You'll note that I've mostly been talking about Section 8, but I've been so tricky the whole time because there are actually two types of Section 8 housing. But don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's go over some of these. I'm not going to read this to you line by line because we have so many bits of information to share today. But really what I want to turn your attention to are these two columns in the middle. So as you go through with these various types of housing programs, you'll see who actually owns and operates the housing versus who is eligible for the housing. So with Section 8 HCV, which is Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, that's what I've been talking about this whole time. This is the only program that we'll be discussing today where the landlord is basically looking at a tenant by tenant basis for Section 8 participation. You could choose to become a project-based Section 8 housing provider. That would mean that you have a property that is accepting Section 8 folks, and the participation in the program stays with the property. So, for example, if your tenants move out of that property, the Section 8 qualification does not move out with them. If you are a Section 8 HCV landlord, then the qualification is based on the tenant themselves. So if your tenant moves out, your property would have to either, if you want to keep participating in the program, accept someone else with a housing choice voucher, or otherwise determine if you want to move forward. But it's not still a Section 8 property once they've moved out. Okay. I know it gets a little bit confusing, but that is the main differentiator between Section 8 housing. Again, when I say Section 8 henceforth and before this, I am referring to the HCV program because that is the one that y'all have the most questions about. But there are different programs out there. If you are curious, we will be sending you this deck after the presentation so you can look at all of these in depth and do more research if you want to specifically help people with disabilities, for example. Yes, you can do that in Section 8 HCV, but you could look to join Section 811. Lots of different things out there. Of course, that's for nonprofit organization, but you see, it gets a little bit complicated. So now I've got a question for you guys. Have you ever participated in any kind of housing assistance program? Let us know in that poll. It's interesting stuff. Now, Samantha, I think I asked you offline, but did your properties have any kind of assisted housing program tie-in?
We did not. No, I worked in multifamily housing between 250 and 1,500 units in both North and South Carolina and Colorado. And at my properties, the management company did not participate in the Section 8 program. So at that time, we were not required to accept Section 8 or anything along those lines. And so we did not participate in the program.
Sure. Totally valid. Okay, I'll give y'all like 5 more seconds here. Go ahead and click clack in if you're interested, but I'm really excited to share these results with you. Okay. So, loving the curiosity that I'm seeing. Most folks haven't participated before, but they are curious about seeing if it's right for them. A couple folks are saying no, and I'm not interested. That's okay. I applaud you for being here to learn more about it. And for those who have either done it before and they've stopped or want to stop, and those who have done it and would like to continue, glad you're all in the mix. Feel free to share your experiences in the chat. Just remember to be kind and to talk about folks the way you'd want to be talked about. With that, let's dive even deeper into Section 8 HCV. Again, that is Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. Quite the mouthful, but it is an important program and one that serves quite a few folks. So let's give you some broad context for the program itself. More than 80% of households participating in Section 8 HCV earn less than $20,000 per year. 43% of them have children in this program, 43% of families, and 43% of households in Section 8 have at least one disabled family member. So definitely just helps to paint a picture of the participants in this program and help you remember that these are folks just looking to live. Something that's interesting that you might not know is that the rental industry seasonality also impacts Section 8 waiting lists, which we're going to touch on here. So if a family tries to get on the list in the summer when seasonality is hot, there are a lot of people moving in and out of apartments. Unfortunately, that can make their wait even longer. So the seasonality of the rental industry trickles down and impacts this housing program as well. But how does it actually work? Well, the prospective tenant, so the voucher holder, is going to first have to apply themselves to get that voucher. When they are applying through their local PHA, their public housing agency, they are going to be put through a background check and employment verification. I note this here because one, it's a part of the process, you need to know it, but two, just because they're getting a background check here does not mean that you should not be screening these applicants when they come across your desk. So they will be twice screened, which is nice, extra security, extra verification of who's going to be moving in, but don't slack just because they have to have a background check to join the program. Do your own as well so that you can evaluate them against your tenant screening criteria. Once they get all that paperwork out of the way, if they're unable to be placed immediately, which is typically what happens, the PHA is going to put approved tenants on a waiting list. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, among the 50 largest housing agencies, only 2 have average wait times of under a year for families that have made it off the waiting list. The longest have wait times of up to 8 years on average. Very, very long time to be waiting. And on average, nationally, families that receive vouchers had spent close to 2.5 years on wait lists first. So it is a very long process. However, once their name hits the top of that wait list, they are then given their housing voucher. Now, the choice in housing choice voucher comes in because they can then go and apply for prospective properties, specifically ones that accept their housing voucher if they are in a state where you can discriminate against source of income, right? If there are states where you can put that language in your listing, it's going to be trickier for the tenant to try and find a spot. So they're going to be looking around for whoever can accept that voucher and appropriately apply for it. So they'll still fill out an application, any kind of screening information you need, that is still going to go on, use your typical process, but that is where this comes in. If they are accepted into, when they're accepted to a property, the tenant will be paying 30% of their household income toward housing, including utilities. 70% is coming from the public housing agency. So that is the typical split. Now, if you have an amazing property and it's a little bit over the market rate, it's possible, depending on where you live, that the tenant can pay the difference, right? So the PHA is still going to pay 70% of the cap for your area. The tenant could then choose to pay the additional portion. Again, know your local laws because that does not hold true for every county and state, but that is true in some counties and states. Another great pause point before we get even deeper into the folks within the Housing Choice Voucher Program. What questions do we have?
So many.
So many.
Okay. Let's see. Do you have a form for denial of an application? I know there's typically a caveat with the proper wording to avoid being in trouble with Fair Housing Depot.
So that is a great question. I don't have a form, but what I can say is that landlords screen their tenants for free on TurboTenant. And when you do that, if you pull their screening report and you decide to reject them, you can then click a button and we send that communication on your behalf. So it includes all the information that they need to fulfill their rights. It crosses that off of your task list so you don't have to worry about passing that information over or trying to be the middleman between the tenant and the credit bureaus. So that would be my recommendation. Use us. It's free for you. The tenant will have to pay the screening fee, but other than that, you do not have to worry. So shameless little plug, but that is what I would do.
Nice. Let's see, I had another one down here I had saved. Okay, so in a scenario where the landlord receives 60% of the payment from Section 8, but the tenant does not pay the remaining 40%. You can't file for eviction in New Jersey as long as you're receiving a partial payment. So what are the options? I have a statement.
Go for it. Yeah, take it away.
In my lease agreements, I always said that partial payments were not accepted until all payments were received. So if I received that check from the housing authority or the whatever the organization is in your area, but I hadn't received the payment from the tenant yet, I would not deposit either of those funds until I have the full amount. If you have sort of a direct deposit or situation with the housing authority, you can typically notify them ahead of time that is the process that you're going to use. And then that would stop the payment for the following month. So you would be like 1 month behind on that tenant's payment, but then you would notify the housing authority so that they do not issue the second month's payment so that you have the authority to file eviction. And of course, notify the PHA that you are filing.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, once you notify them and let them know, hey, this is the situation that's going on, please stop your payment, they might be able to help you communicate and outreach with that tenant, right? Because they don't want someone in the program who's not paying rent. That makes the program look bad, frankly. It adds to the stigma that we see against this program. So by and large, they're likely to want to help you try and make this right, whether that means reaching out on your behalf or otherwise trying to get in touch. Don't be afraid to let your local PHA know if there are issues like this going on.
When it comes to Section 8 program approval, can you have your property approved in advance, or do you have to wait until you have a prospective tenant to initiate the process? If it's the formal, how long does that approval last?
Yeah, so I'm going to tackle the easy part first. Approval lasts for 1 to 2 years, depending on where you live. I wish I had a more exact answer for you, but people haven't made it easy with the laws changing state by state and county by county. So 1 to 2 years there. In terms of whether or not you can enact that inspection before you get a voucher, I would imagine that the answer is yes. I would imagine that if you go to your local PHA and you say, I'm interested in participating in this program, I'd like to set up an inspection, they would likely be more than happy to help you because, again, there is a huge need for affordable housing. So people who are at the forefront, who are ready to get the work done before they have an applicant, that's fantastic. They also might be able to tell you about specific spots to advertise your listing that are Section 8 specific, right? So local areas, local boards where you should put your listing to try and attract tenants, which could cut down on your vacancy time.
And on that note of listings, are we allowed to or required to state in some way on listings that Section 8 needs to be disclosed before applying? And then a second question came in saying, am I allowed to put on my listing that I'm not accepting Section 8?
Ooh, so again, easy one first. Whether or not you're allowed to say that you are not accepting Section 8 tenants depends on where you live. If there is a source of income discrimination law where you live, then no, you can't say that because that would be discriminatory. So I would refer back to the map that I had a couple of slides back. When we send this deck out to you, take a look. Also, be sure to do your own research just in case there's something county specific. These rules can change 5 miles down the road, and the only way to know what is allowed in your space is to do some of that research. What was the first part of that question? Because I missed it in my my spiel about research.
Should we put it in our listing that we are accepting or are not accepting Section 8?
Yeah, I would personally not put ever that I'm not accepting Section 8 housing, Section 8 vouchers, regardless of where I lived, because you open yourself up for potential issues and stickiness when you could just, again, treat them as any other tenant and see if they meet your criteria, assuming you're in a state that allows you to just move through pretty smoothly. Should you put that you are accepting Section 8 vouchers? Yeah, if you are, I would. That, again, it's just indicating to your audience that, hey, this is a property that they could pursue, particularly if you're not in an environment where it's only Section 8 properties being listed. That's a good way to have yours stand out.
Yep. And Ricardo in the chat said that in Raleigh, our TMLS has it as a required yes or no field, and our local housing authorities will permit free listings on their website if you accept.
Good to know.
Check in with your PHA.
Yeah.
All right. Back to you, Krista.
Scooting right along. So let's get into how you can qualify and some of the other demographics here about the Section 8 program. So again, and I know people hate when I say this, but it is going to vary based on where you live. I'm sorry. It's the government. They they made it so that there are rules different in every state. I'm joking, but there are 4 common factors that you should consider when thinking about your own eligibility, or excuse me, not your eligibility, but renters' eligibility to join Section 8. It's going to come down to their income level, which of course is going to be evaluated as a household, right? So on average, a household's income level must be less than 50% of the local median income of the area to be considered low income. These income limits are adjusted based on the location of the housing agency itself and the number of members there are in a household. So quite a few factors at play to determine what income level is acceptable for your area. The next thing people are going to look at is the family size and composition. So families that are bigger with larger with more members are going to have a higher limit on their household income for eligibility. The thinking there is that there are more people who are able to work and bring in that money. However, if there is an elderly family member or someone who's disabled, then the likelihood that the family is going to qualify for Section 8 increases quite a bit. Next, they are going to look at the citizen status of everyone who applies. So only citizens and certain legal immigrants are qualified to apply for the Section 8 housing program. Lastly, they're going to look at previous evictions and also criminal records. So households that have been repeatedly evicted from their housing, it indicates that there's a higher risk of future evictions, which is a reason that they could be denied housing assistance. Of course, with all of this in mind, the waiting list gets really long. We've talked about that. There are some things that can boost families to the top of the waiting list, such as being homeless or living in substandard housing, if they spend more than half of their household income on rent, if they've been involuntarily displaced, or if there are victims of child abuse or domestic violence within the family. These are all reasons why they might be jettisoned to the top of the list to find secure housing. In terms of being disqualified to join the program as a renter, of course, we've mentioned evictions, but specifically if they've been evicted from subsidized housing in the past for a serious lease violation, they are very unlikely to get into another program. Additionally, if they are using or creating illicit drugs, if they have a history of alcohol or illegal drug abuse that could threaten others, they will not be accepted into the program. However, the PHA does have to provide a reason for denying a Section 8 applicant, just as you guys do if you pull a screening report and deny someone afterward. And households have the option to file an appeal if any of the circumstances that led to their denial have changed. Something to keep in mind. In terms of the landlord side of things, when it comes to your eligibility to join the program, really boils down to your ability to provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing. So you will have to agree to abide by the program's rules via a contract, and you will also have to pass the initial inspection, but then typically annual inspections thereafter. In some states, they are biannual, which here I'm using to mean once every 2 years. So again, don't be afraid to call up your local PHA and ask some of these questions if you want to get the full scoop for your area specifically. In the meantime, I would love to know in the chat if you have participated in the program before. I'd love to know the most and least appealing part of Section 8 housing. Again, keep it kind. You can share your stories, share your truth, but don't be attacking people or anything of the sort. Otherwise, I'll be so disappointed.
See, can't discriminate against evictions or criminal history. I think there's a previous conversation they were tagging on to.
Okay.
Let's see. The direct deposit rent. Yes, definitely a benefit. The most appealing is the guaranteed rent, or at least partially. We did hear from several landlords that their COVID-8 For COVID 8, wow, it's been a long day. There's Section 8 participants or tenants actually helped them stay afloat during COVID because those were guaranteed payments they were getting every month, whereas some of their other tenants were maybe not able to come up with partial or full payments during that time.
Absolutely.
Least appealing, lack of accountability and respect of property. The laws are not landlord friendly in California. Appealing, knowing you're helping out someone who needs affordable housing.
Yeah, definitely a mixed bag, right? That's why it's so important to look at every aspect of this, including what's going on in your local PHA to determine if it's right for you. That's why I think it would be irresponsible of us to paint with a broad brush and say like, yeah, everybody do it, or like everybody don't do it, because really it's just like being a landlord in every other aspect. You're going to have great tenants, you might have bad tenants. It might be really smooth, it could be a little choppy, right? But I appreciate you guys sharing some of your thoughts about that. We'll go ahead and keep trucking along. I lied. Are there any questions in the chat that we should address right away before I continue trucking along?
We do have some questions. So this one I thought was interesting because I didn't have the answer right off the top of my head. Do you know if Housing Authority do a real-time review of the voucher applicant's ability to pay? Like if they have employment, if they can comfortably meet their portion to pay? Because when you run the applicant's credit, from my experience, the applicant hasn't paid off their debts from previous months. So why accept the application when there's no guarantee they can pay you?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, when the PHA is evaluating prospective program members, they are pulling their employment verification to make sure that they are getting money in so that they have their portion of the expected rent. That's why they base it off of the area itself to determine what that median income is and like how it can shift so that they can focus on the tenant paying 30% of that set figure for the area and they are responsible for the 70. But it's a huge component of the program that the tenant be able to fulfill their 30%. So that's something that they're looking for off the bat when they are pursuing these different, or when I should say when the applicant is applying.
Perfect. And I see a couple people have raised their hands. So just a quick reminder, we can't see or hear you. So if you have questions, use that Q&A so that we can get them in our queue over there. Let's see. When looking at my PHA, I see they display a range of rent rates for the number of bedrooms in my property. Can I simply choose the top end of that rate for my listed rent? Notably, if I'm confident that I'll have Section 8 tenants and don't care as much if fewer non-Section 8 tenants apply, since it's at the top end of market rent.
Ooh, hard to say without looking at the website with you. They don't typically let you choose what rent is being paid in that way, right? Like they're going to evaluate your property and let you know, hey, based on what we see similarly, based on the median income levels of prospective renters in this area, this is the cap, this is what we would be willing to pay. But if you're comfortable with what you're seeing in the range, I would say in your shoes, I would look at what they evaluated my property to be at. And if I had questions or I thought it should be higher, I would then talk to them and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Here are other properties around me that have similar costs. And they're at this level. This is where I am. How can we close the gap, basically, and see what they say.
Perfect. We have a few questions in the Q&A about reporting tenants to the PHA. So it looks like somebody is asking specifically as it's relating to drug use, or somebody else is asking about as it relates to hiding income from the PHA. Do you have insight to that?
Ooh, yeah. So drug use, let's go with drug use first. That is a lease violation most of the time, right? Like typically in leases, there's some kind of language about illicit activities on the property. If there are illicit activities going on, you can then serve the tenant a lease violation notice and also let the PHA know at that point, just in case it unfortunately goes down the route of an eviction. Keep them in the loop. They are your partners with this. When it comes to hiding income, that one is significantly trickier because how do you know? If there's something definitive that you could point to, but I don't even know what that would be. So that would be really hard, I would say. You could reach out to your PHA caseworker and perhaps share your concerns if there's something definitive to point to, but be careful because you don't know how people make their money. And I say that mostly because it can look like, oh, this Section 8 tenant has a new iPhone. How'd they get that? It could have been a gift from their grandma who doesn't have anything to do with their rent. It could be, something else, some extenuating circumstance. So it's way easier if there are things that you can trace back to the lease and then let them know lease violation. Here's a notice for the PHA. Hiding income, that is trickier. I'd be curious to know more details, but maybe this isn't the spot for it.
Okay, one more, and then I'll let you move on.
Okay.
Do you know if they only allow long-term leases versus month to month as sort of an experiment to make sure the landlady and tenants are good matches for each other?
Ooh, I didn't see any specific national requirements for lease length as I was researching this topic. I would imagine that you could, well, so the thing with month to month and the Section 8 housing voucher program is they are trying to establish stable housing. When you have a month to month lease, it is good, but it's more unstable than, let's say, a 6-month lease. I would recommend contacting your local PHA, seeing if they have any restrictions on it, and asking for their feedback on if you will struggle to find a Section 8 tenant who is willing to do a month-to-month lease, because that could also be a factor in this decision.
Perfect. All right. I've saved some juicy ones for the end, so we'll keep you going.
Love it. Okay, so let's get into the meat of this, which is how would you join if you decide that this is good for your business? First and foremost, you're going to do the thing I've been talking about this whole time, which is contacting your local PHA, your local public housing agency. Let them know that you are interested in this. And that's whether a tenant has come to you first or if you're just doing it of your own volition. Either way, contacting them is going to be your first step. The PHA is going to provide you details on the local process and the method for posting your vacant units. This is where they might share those sites or boards where Section 8 housing is specifically listed by itself to help you really increase your net and get those tenants in there. So on their end, the PHA is going to be admitting eligible families to the program as we've gone over. You can then have people start applying to your property. Again, you're going to want to select them based on your own rental criteria, continue to have them fill out your application, do your screening report, do everything that you would for any other tenant to make sure that this is going to be a good fit. You've determined that it's a good fit. Awesome. Then you're going to fill out their request for tenancy approval form. So this is a form that the tenant brings with them to the residence that they'd like to live in. You fill it out as the property owner / landlord, and they will send it back to the PHA. When you do that, that is the first sign that the PHA has regarding your proposed rent. So they're going to be looking at the figure that you spit out and see if it's reasonable compared to similar units in the local marketplace. And if it's not, they'll usually let you know. If it's significantly higher than the rent paid by unassisted tenants on the premises, that is going to be bad news bears. You will not get in. So again, keep it consistent. Don't try and have the government pay more than what you are charging a non-government supported tenant. Once all that has been done, you will be able to set up an inspection. Now, this is the initial inspection, although depending on your area, every 1 to 2 years, you'll have to do it again to make sure that your property meets these 13 housing quality standards. I won't read every single one to you. They're pretty common sense, right? It's things like sanitary facilities. If there's lead-based paint, are you letting people know? How is the air quality? Things of this nature. The most common deficiencies during these inspections include doors not locking or latching properly, if the unit lacks a working fridge, windows in poor condition that don't lock or have screens, not having an emergency exit, that comes up more often than you think, and of course, having like a lack of proper ventilation. If any of these things come up, you will be alerted. In fact, your inspector will let you know if there are non-life-threatening or life-threatening deficiencies. There are different timelines for rectifying those situations depending on the degree of severity of the deficiency. So when I send you over this deck, you can go ahead and look at it to see what that looks like. Of course, with life-threatening deficiencies, you have to act faster. That's my little teaser for you to get you to go look at the full thing. But if it's life-threatening, act quick. It's an emergency. Otherwise, you have a little bit of time. Once your property gets the A-OK, you can go ahead and sign the lease with your tenant. You guys will also be signing a housing assistance payment contract. So that is a contract from the PHA. This is the thing that dictates what percentage the tenant is responsible to pay versus the PHA, and also the consequences if payments are not made. So this is really important. You will want to have a copy of it yourself and keep that in your documents. Then you can start receiving rent payments, which is great, right? Like that is the main thing here. However, slight caveat, we'll get into it, but your first payment is going to be delayed, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. So the benefits of participating in Section 8 housing include earning a steady income, because unlike tenants from the private market, you know that you're guaranteed to receive at least a portion of rent owed to you each month via that housing subsidy. You'll also enjoy reduced vacancy rates. Once your tenant moves out, someone from the Section 8 waiting list is bound to get in contact with you because, again, these waiting lists have families on there for years at a time on average. Also, renting to voucher holders means that you are renting to people who have undergone double screening. It's not, the PHA screening is not a replacement for your screening. I'll say it till I'm blue in the face, but it is something that can give you extra peace of mind as you move through. And of course, helping people in need is a huge benefit of participating in this program. You are helping to provide affordable housing for folks who could otherwise end up houseless, which is unfortunate and traumatic in its own right. Of course, though, there are drawbacks, and it's important to keep these in mind before you jump into the program. So first and foremost, you are required to meet standards set by HUD's real estate assessment inspector. And these inspections can only be conducted by qualified professionals as dictated by your local PHA. If your property doesn't pass its inspection, you will be asked to perform additional maintenance and try again. Additionally, most folks report that they do not get their first month's payment on time from the government. Let's make that very clear. It's the government with the first payment being late. Unfortunately, there are typically processing delays, which can make it take 1 to 2 months on average to get your first payment in. I believe we had someone last session who said that they had 3 months wait before their first paycheck came in, their first rent check came in. So that is something to keep in mind. And I would recommend trying to touch base with other local Section 8 landlords to determine like what their experiences have been if you are particularly worried about the wait. Last drawback to consider here is, of course, the limit to regular rent increases. So once you are a Section 8 landlord and those vouchers are paid out, they are paid out based on the annual fair market rent in your area. So you can't raise rent more than once a year. And when you do go to raise rent, you'll need to make sure that it's still in line with what the PHA is willing to pay if you plan to continue having that Section 8 housing choice voucher participant in your property. All right. So this is usually where I'd pause for more questions, but we're so close to the end and I'm about to answer some frequently asked questions that I'm going to keep going. I know I'm going a little wild, but
I'll allow it. I'll allow it, Krista. Do your thing.
Thank you, Samantha. I'm going rogue. So these are a collection of the most commonly asked questions that we got from all of you when it comes to the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. First off, can you charge the same amount for Section 8 tenants as you do with non-Section 8 tenants? The answer is yes. If it's a reasonable rent and it isn't higher than units in the area with similar amenities, you are all clear. You can charge full rent no matter who the tenant is. And if you make substantial upgrades, or let's say the fair market rent for your area increases, you can increase the monthly rent charged once you have approval from the PHA. Security deposits. It's a hot topic all of itself, but particularly when it comes to Section 8, you should know that you can charge a security deposit for Section 8 tenants, and you should. I've linked out to where you can find your state's maximum security deposit amount in the deck. Once we send that over, it is all yours to click on. But the reason for this, so the security deposit is going to act here as it would with any other tenant. So it's going to account for any damages in the property once they leave. If there's unpaid rent, it can also account for that. Be sure you're up to date with your local laws to know when that's appropriate. Something else to keep in mind, though, is that the security deposit is paid by the tenant. It is not part of the money that comes in from their PHA. However, there are other programs that provide housing assistance and specifically provide security deposit assistance. So there is help out there, but I would still highly recommend charging this security deposit for all tenants. If you need more information about security deposit, just in general, check out our webinar that I've linked on this page when we send you the deck. Oh, and before I forget, when it comes to how much you're allowed to charge for the security deposit, of course, there are rules based on your state, based on your locality. But the landlord can charge a Section 8 tenant the maximum deposit that your state allows. So if we break this down, the amount that you're charging for the security deposit is going to be the same as the amount that the security, my notes are confusing me. I'm so sorry. Basically, in a state that allows a maximum security deposit equal to 1 month's rent, let's say that 1 month's rent is $1,000, you can still charge the full $1,000 as your 1 month's rent, even though the tenant is only responsible for $300 per month as their 30% of that. The security deposit can be the full amount. That's what I'm trying to get across to you. Ooh. If there is damage to your property, what can you do? Well, of course, you can withhold that security deposit, which is why I tell you that you should collect it. If there is damage above and beyond what the security deposit pays, you'll want to let the PHA know. They can then help you ask the renter to pay for repairs. If they refuse, their voucher may be terminated. They may be kicked out of the program. Additionally, there is a provision in the PHA that says if a tenant causes more than $500 in damage to the property, you can file a claim in small claims court against them, and you may be able to access a mitigation fund for monetary assistance, usually through the PHA. So all things to keep in mind. Again, keep in good contact with your local PHA if you're a part of this program or if you're just curious about it, because it will definitely help you make the good decision for you. It's also important to note here that the claim amount for damages caused by a Section 8 tenant cannot exceed the monthly rent amount less the security deposit plus amounts collected from a tenant to pay for the damages. So for example, your unit rents for $900 per month. The security deposit was $500. Let's say they caused $1,000 worth of damages. HUD will pay damages up to $400, which is the rent minus the security deposit. All right. With this in mind, I recommend doing regular inspections of your Section 8 property as you would any other property. We typically recommend doing it quarterly, but that way you can catch problems before they spiral into big situations and communicate with your tenant to let them know, hey, this is something that could impact your security deposit when you move out. Also, there's nothing that says that Section 8 tenants are any worse than their peers. And a lot of the situations that we're talking about here could lead to them getting their voucher revoked. So having conversations leading up to that point can, one, improve your relationship, but two, save you a lot of headache and stress and money versus going down an eviction route. Ooh, my throat's dry. All right. In that realm, there is no data to support the idea that HCV renters are any worse than their non-HCV counterparts. They don't do more damage. Excuse me. They're not less likely to pay rent. And in fact, they typically stay for longer than other tenants, right? They're usually there for 7 to 8 years on average. I'm just going to cough for the rest of this webinar. Okay. Evictions. It is very possible to evict someone from your property, even if they're Section 8 renters. You would follow pretty much the same procedure. They're held to the lease just as any other tenant is. But the main difference, you do need to notify your PHA and the tenant. And usually there is a longer notification window that you have to give. So it could be 60 to 90 days. Make sure that you know what it is before you get into this kind of situation to save yourself stress. Also, if your tenant is disabled, provide the notice in a form that's accessible to them. So don't just hand a blind person a piece of paper with no braille on it. That would be rude and irresponsible. Don't do that. Give them something that they can understand so that you can move forward. Excuse me. All right. If you accept one HCV tenant, do you have to accept all of them in all of your units? The answer is no. You do not have to, right? You are accepting one tenant. You are not a Section 8 property landlord. You are a Section 8 housing choice voucher landlord, which means the acceptance is tied to the tenant. If you do decide to accept more than one HCV tenant, excuse me, just be sure that you don't steer them toward one specific location or one specific floor in a property. That would be a violation of fair housing. So don't do that. It's considered steering. Let me know if you have questions about that while I cough. Okay, we're nearly to the end. So now is the time to open it up and answer your questions. I have here on the screen an opportunity for you to tell your friends about TurboTenant and earn $25 per referral. But before you go fleeing, let's answer some of your questions.
All right. So I lost the specific question here, but the gist of it is if you are in a state where you cannot discriminate based on income, and you have the Section 8 tenants, you're going through the inspection process to be approved to your property, and you do not wish to make the repairs required to be approved for Section 8. Are you violating fair housing by not doing those repairs if you cannot discriminate based on source of income?
I believe the answer is no. Because if we look at this, like, especially if it's a very costly repair, you might not have the wiggle room in your business to actually get it done. So it's not a violation of fair housing rights to not move forward with that kind of maintenance, as long as it's not something that specifically correlates to a disability, right? If you're like, no, I refuse to put in a ramp because I hate ramps, that's a different situation. But most likely the PHA inspector is not going to be asking you about like fair housing accommodations.
Let's see. How long can a tenant be on Section 8 or the housing choice voucher program?
They can be on it up until the point that they no longer qualify based on their income or any other extenuating circumstances. But typically income is the reason that people leave the program, because they end up earning more, or perhaps there's a change in family composition, someone gets married, etc. And that allows them to no longer qualify because they earn more money.
Perfect. A landlord did ask if we could walk through the process from signing up a Section 8 tenant for the first time, how to apply, and how to set up direct deposits. That process is going to vary depending on your location. So I would recommend just doing a Google search for Public Housing Authority and then the city or state combination where you're located so that you can get those resources and more information. Somebody had also asked about helping their tenant get set up, and that is also the same recommendation there, is find your local Public Housing Authority or PHA so that you can find more resources that are relevant to your specific property.
Yes. And to add on, I would recommend Googling like the city where your property is located and public housing agency and .gov. That will lead you to a government website that gives you the contact information for your local PHA so that you can get in touch with them.
Okay. Let's see here. Can you explain the income qualification? Does the voucher have to cover the base rent?
So the voucher is going to cover 30% of the base rent and utilities. It's going to cover all of that in one fell swoop. The remaining 70% is going to be coming from the PHA.
Do we have to include utilities in our rent?
No, you don't have to include utilities in your rent. But the idea is that the tenant is not spending more than 30% of their household income on the combination of utilities and rent itself. So it could be divided up depending on your local PHA, where they have like the check for you, that 30% from the tenant, or maybe it's like 28%, and then the 2% that they're paying individually because utilities are not in the rent. But that would depend based on where you live.
Perfect. Where can I find local state laws to see where income discrimination laws apply and find more information?
Yeah, check out this deck. We're going to email it to you pretty shortly after the presentation. I have a link for the graph that I showed, so you can click through and determine what's going on in your state. Easy peasy.
Nice. Let's see. If there's more than one person residing in the home and only one is listed on the voucher, can we still require them to apply and deny based on the non-voucher applicant if they do not qualify?
Yeah. Okay, so the thing that's giving me pause with this question is the idea of people cohabitating where one person is holding a voucher and the other is not. If they're one family unit, everybody should be on the voucher. If they're not, and let's say it's like well, yeah, that starts to get sticky. So everybody, all adults who are living in that family and are like should be on the voucher is my understanding. However, if you do have, let's say, a roommate situation, so let's say I am your housing choice voucher recipient and Samantha is just my really rad roommate. We're not married, we're just roommates. She could be a non-Section 8 housing tenant and I could be the Section 8 housing tenant, in which case you could deny her just as you would for any other reason. But that is curious. I'm not, I would double check on if that is allowed in your state or if there's some kind of sneakery going on, because all adults who are considered one household should be on that voucher.
Absolutely. Let's see. Due to inflation, can you reassess security deposit every year with a lease renewal?
No. So once you collect the security deposit, you've collected it. I mean, like, there's really not a way to go back to my understanding, but I'm pausing now because I feel like, Samantha, do you have different information? Am I off my rocker? I know we've talked about it in the security deposit webinar. So feel free to go watch that. I've plugged it here, but Samantha, thoughts?
Yeah, so you certainly could, I guess, adjust the security deposit, but if you're adjusting the security deposit, you also want to start a brand new lease agreement, and not just do like an addendum to extend the dates or change the rates, because the security deposit is really built into that lease agreement and to that contract. But of course, as we always say, check your state and local landlord tenant laws to make sure, because they do vary widely. All right, let's see. Can you say on your ad that you're not currently approved for Section 8?
Yeah, that is something that I wouldn't think would violate fair housing laws, even if you're in an area with source of income discrimination laws. However, tread carefully. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a good-looking researcher. So bear that in mind and make sure that you're not violating anything on the local or county level. But from the base, it doesn't sound like something that would be an issue.
Perfect. Let's see. An attendee has let us know that in Michigan, the contract always says only the persons named on the voucher may reside in the residence, and they expect the landlord to enforce by notifying the PHA. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah,
the more you know. And I think maybe one more, because we've already held these people hostage for so long. If the rent is $1,000 and the prospect has a voucher for $800, do we income qualify them on their portion of rent or the full rent amount? We typically require 3 times the monthly rent.
Yeah, that's a really good question. To me, it'd be like a conditional acceptance, right? Like if you go based on the voucher, how will that impact your business? Like, what is going to go on? Are they still going to be in a good spot to make the payments regularly? That's something that only you can say. Samantha, do you have any insight here? Like, I'm curious, would you accept someone? I know I'm putting you on the spot, but gotta hear your thoughts.
So I can't say if I would accept them because I don't have their full application and screening report in front of me, right? So I can't compare that to my screening criteria to determine if they are qualified. With the information that I have, let's say the rent is $1,000. Ignore the amount of the voucher. The rent is $1,000. You require 3 times the monthly rent. So you're looking for $3,000 a month in income. Part of that income that I would consider is the amount of the voucher. So that's how I would do that. But again, double check state and local laws. If they have specific guidelines for your PHA, they have specific requirements to consider, then definitely follow up with your local PHA.
Yes, and just to final one, brilliantly said. 2, your PHA will be able to answer these questions for you when you reach out to them. They might even have it on their website already, so don't be afraid to poke around, but they'll be able to give you some of those ins and outs specific to your area.
Nice. And with that, I put a link in the chat again for our Facebook group. If you have more questions, please feel free to hop over there, request to join. We've got just a few questions for you to get you in the group. And then we can chat about it some more.
Beautiful. Thank you guys for being here today. It has been a blast talking with you. We do have a brief survey that'll pop up after we close this down, but just want to say thank you again to Samantha. Thank you to the audience, and thank you to Jonathan behind the scenes. It is always great to have y'all here. Bye.
Bye.